Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of the Diplomacy and Diversity series with Deborah Chatsis, who will engage us in a conversation about Indigeneity and diplomacy, representing Canada across the globe as an Indigenous woman. My name is Lois Harder, and I am principal of the Peter Lougheed Leadership College. It is my honor to welcome you today on behalf of my University of Alberta colleagues in the signature area of research and teaching excellence known as SKIP, Situated Knowledges, Indigenous Peoples and Place, and the University of Alberta International. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is situated on Treaty 6 territory and Métis Nation homeland, a traditional gathering place of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others, whose histories, languages, and cultures underpin our contemporary community. Of course, we meet here on a virtual platform, and thus I would ask you to reflect on your respective locations and the peoples who came before you, who called that land home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We are so grateful to everyone for taking the time to join us today, and I would particularly want to acknowledge the participation of Michael Vandergrift, Deputy Minister Champion for the University of Alberta in the Government of Canada, as well as officials from Global Affairs Canada and the Alberta Consular Corps. The idea for this series on diversity and diplomacy is the brainchild of my colleague, Alex Kuznetsov at University of Alberta International, and a wonderful collaboration with Christian Gonzalez-Paez, Danielle Scott, and Peter Carter, also of UAI, as well as Florence Glanfield, Keisha Supernant, and our moderator today, Matt Wildcat of SKIP. Also Susanna Lumen from the Intersections of Gender signature area, and my colleague Shelby McLeod at the Lougheed Leadership College. Today, of course, we are also extremely grateful to Deborah Chatsis for her willingness to participate in this conversation and share her insights on Indigenous identity and the work of international diplomacy on behalf of Canada. Deborah is Cree and a member of the Ahtahkakoop First Nation near Prince Albert, Saskatchewan in Treaty 6 territory. She holds an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and a law degree from the University of Saskatchewan, a master's of law from the University of Ottawa, and a master's of public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. While Deborah is now retired from the Foreign Service, her 30-plus year career included posts as Canadian Ambassador to Vietnam, Director of South Asia Relations for Global Affairs Canada, and Canadian Ambassador to Guatemala and High Commissioner to Belize. She worked in both Geneva and New York on the negotiations surrounding the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and has also served on secondment to Indian Affairs and Northern Affairs Canada as Senior Advisor, Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Deborah has had an amazing career in Canada's Foreign Service, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome her today. I'm going to cede the screen to my colleague, Dr. Matt Wildcat, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. He will welcome Deborah with a smudging, followed by a conversation, and then our colleague, Dr. Florence Glanfield, who is Vice Provost of Indigenous Programming and Research, will be fielding your questions. I know some folks submitted questions when you registered, but if something occurs to you as the discussion unfolds, please feel free to use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to post your questions. I'll turn it over now to Matt.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Harder. It's really a pleasure to be here today. When me and Deborah we had our initial meeting, I thought it was a good idea to have a smudge to start all of this. And so a lot of people, when they talk about the smudge, they talk about its healing properties to cleanse bad energy or bad feelings. About 2 years ago, I realized that I had to stop asking elders to do this because it's something that students ask for in class, and I had to figure out how I was going to do it myself. And so the teaching that I offer, and it's personalized to me. I don't intend to represent how Indigenous peoples do smudge at large, is that when you do a smudge, the purpose of it is, what I ask students is not to let go of bad feelings, but that when we do this smudge, Sweetgrass, it gives you a moment to decide what you want to bring into that space you're going to be a part of and what you want to let go. And so for me today, what I want to bring into this room is an acknowledgement of some of the health issues that Deborah is going through, and offer my wish to Deborah that I hope this smudge is healing to you in whatever way it needs to be. So I'm gonna smudge myself. I'll hold it up to the camera so people can do a virtual smudge, or if you have smudge in your own space, you can do that as well too. So I'm just going to hold this up for you, Deborah. Okay. So, Deborah, where I wanted to start out is, when you were younger, your parents lived in Germany, and you grew up hearing stories about all sorts of different parts of the world. So, is there anything in particular that sticks out as a memory that, when you were young, that opened up this curiosity of yours about the wider world that we live in?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's really a pleasure to have this conversation and to talk about the subject, which is something that's of real interest to me. Yes, my father was in the army and was posted in Germany, and he and my mother lived there for a few years. And since they were younger and without children, they traveled a lot. So when I grew up, my father had his army trunk filled with souvenirs from their life in Europe, from the ships that they took over there and back, to all of the, all of the souvenirs from trips they took within Europe. My mother's fancy handbag she bought somewhere, postcards, menus from the ship, that sort of thing. And it really inspired in me a wish to travel. And that was something that I held on, obviously, for the rest of my life, and still now, just waiting for COVID to end so I can go on a trip somewhere again.
So, the work you've done all around the world, it's amazing. But in, one of the news articles I was reading, you said you're surprised your life took you in that direction. So, what led you to the role in the Foreign Service? And, was there any specific moments where you realized you needed to change your career path that kind of directed you in that way?
Well, that happened a couple of times. One was mentioned earlier. My first degree was in mechanical engineering. And so I was studying this because I was good at math and science. And I thought that it would be useful, a useful degree. But while I was studying, I realized that I didn't think I would make a good engineer, and that my interest was really in law. So I took the LSAT and eventually got into law school. And my idea was to work in sort of corporate law area, work on intellectual property, where a lot of the lawyers have backgrounds in engineering. That's something that suited my education and my skills. And so I worked for a law firm in Ottawa that did that type of work. And unfortunately, I didn't find the work that interesting. And I remember sitting at my desk in this office, just not at all engaged in the work, wondering what I wanted to do with my life. And then I just realized that I didn't want to spend my time making money for other people. I wanted to take a job where I could make a difference in some way. And it just so happened that a friend of mine was planning on taking the Foreign Service exam and told me about it. So I decided to take the exam, and ultimately succeeded and got in the following year. So that's how, that was kind of my path to the Foreign Service, which wasn't the normal path, I would say.
No, not at all. So, one of the things I'm interested in is, when we talk about being Indigenous, one of the things that we assume is that, it means a strong connection to your territory, right? To your traditional territory. And so in our previous conversation, I could tell you are really connected, but then on the other hand, you've had this career which has taken you all around the world. So, I'm interested in if you have any experiences or insights, particular to your life story that can teach us about what it means to be Indigenous today, like in our contemporary society.
So I grew up off reserve
Mhm.
in British Columbia and in Saskatchewan. Although my parents came from reserves in Saskatchewan, my mother's from Ahtahkakoop, or was from Ahtahkakoop, and my father was from Palmaker. But my father lost his status, and then when my mother married him, she lost her status.
Mm.
So we were non-status until the mid-80s when the bill was put in place that allowed my father to get his status back, and
Mhm.
then ultimately all of us got our status. So that meant that I didn't grow up in the reserve, although when we lived in Saskatchewan and even before, we spent a great deal of time visiting family on the reserve, and a lot in summertime, but my father made an effort to provide us with teachings, about
Mhm.
how we should live our lives, and it was really in accordance with the teachings that he received as a child growing up on the reserve. But he also participated in ceremonies that took place on the reserve, particularly in Palmaker, where my aunt lives. And I've got many memories of sitting on the grass, either outside my aunt's place, or out in the field,
Mhm.
waiting for the feast to start, with the prayers and then serving the food, more prayers. And, that for me, that is kind of the part of the connection that I have with my family and with the community in a larger sense. So I still have gone back for other ceremonies, feasts on the anniversary of deaths, or for other life events. So that's something that I find is helpful to connect with the family and with the community.
Mhm. So what kind of values and principles did you bring with you to the Foreign Service, as an Indigenous woman? And can you think of any moments where your job responsibilities in the Foreign Service conflicted with those values and principles that you brought with you to the job?
I would say that probably one of the most important values is building relations with other people, be that with colleagues from work or with people from other governments or from other communities overseas. And so for me, that's always been kind of the main motivator in terms of the work that I do. But there are many other things. There's having a sense of humor and not taking yourself too seriously. Always, that's something that I always try to do, to not to take myself too seriously,
Mhm, mhm,
and to be humble. And it's a bit of a challenge, um, trying to remain humble and at the same time make your way through a bureaucracy.
mhm,
It's I find that was a challenge. It took me a long time for me to feel comfortable in putting myself forward in terms of promotions, or even, speaking up in meetings. It took me a long time to build that confidence. And part of that was just my own lack of self-confidence, but I think part of it is also a cultural
Yeah.
for learnings. So that's something that I think that probably all of us struggle with as an Indigenous and people from other communities as well.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
in terms of, where kind of Indigenous values conflicted with work, um, one of the examples that I think back on is in our discussions about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Mhm.
We had, the most contentious issues had to do with collective rights, whether it's the use of the term peoples or talking about collective rights to land and resources. And
Mhm.
I think the biggest arguments that we had were within the government team that was negotiating the declaration. And, part of my role, well, I was there as a lawyer to talk about international law, but my value added was being there as an Indigenous people and talking about how collective rights actually work in practice in terms of, the communities on the ground, that's how, we collectively own the land and the resources. And, so that I think was useful in bringing people a sense of a level of comfort
Yeah.
about discussing collective rights within
Hmm.
our delegation and then with other delegations as well.
Hmm. That's really interesting. And just your earlier comments about being humble and how that might it can be difficult. That I think you're absolutely right though, that this is like what I would call like a leadership teaching that people give in Cree families and Cree communities, that you shouldn't put yourself up for something. You should be nominated for something, right? People should be calling on you, right? And it plays a really important legitimacy function, I think, in communities, because you then allow kind of like a collective wisdom of the group to be able to go and select people for leadership roles and other activities. But that practice and that belief does conflict with what we're asked to do in modern society a lot of times, right? Because you do have to kind of put yourself forward, right? And so that's so interesting to hear. Can you think of a moment where being an Indigenous woman helped you in your work?
Yes, a couple of times actually. When I was in Vietnam, I took an interest in kind of leadership training for minority groups.
Hmm.
And in Vietnam, some of those minority groups are really Indigenous groups, but they're not characterized as such. But anyway, so I volunteered to go speak at these leadership sessions for these women from the minority groups. And it was really amazing the first time I was there and I was speaking and I told them that I was an Indigenous woman from Canada. And you could sense like this collective, um, I don't know what it was like a welcome to me,
Mhm.
because they recognized that I represented some of the women in Canada that might have had the same experiences.
Mhm.
And so that was really good. And then also, one of the reasons that I went to Guatemala really was because in that country, about 50% of the population is Indigenous, and it tends to be, the poorer part of the society, disadvantaged. So there's a lot of work to do with Indigenous communities, particularly Indigenous women who are responsible for the homes, but are also really severely disadvantaged even within their own societies. And I always have found that it was easier to have discussions with them if I acknowledged at the beginning that I was an Indigenous woman and that I was interested in their experiences as an Indigenous woman from Guatemala. So I found that it was really useful in building those relationships or building those links with people.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. So, you know, we're doing the diversity and diplomacy series. So, do you have any experience that highlights Canada's Foreign Service, their embrace of diversity, and on the opposite, do you have any experiences that highlight the challenges Foreign Service has with diversity?
Yeah. Well, I think, traditionally, the Foreign Service was seen as, the preserve of white males. And I mean, over the decades, that's changed quite a bit. And now, there's 50% of the work, the people who work at Global Affairs are women, and 50% of the heads of mission now are women. So that's a real advancement that's been made in probably the last decade. So, and I would say that the newer cohorts of staff and of Foreign Service officers are much more diverse than they had been in past. So there's been an effort, but I don't know if there's been a specific effort to hire people, visible minorities and Indigenous, but that's been the result because I think it reflects Canadian society more, to have a diverse employee complement. I would just say that I know that there have been some efforts in the past to specifically recruit Indigenous people. I remember 20 years ago or so, there was a program that brought in some people, but I would say that I don't think it was an overwhelming success because I'm not sure how many people actually stayed. I know one person was from Ahtahkakoop, and she left because she just wanted to go back to her community. And so I think that's part of the challenge is that people, if they grow up in the community and their life is there and their family is there, it's a long way from Ottawa. And, some people make that calculation and decide that they'd rather be back home than going overseas, because going overseas is not easy. It's difficult. You've got to go make a life in a new city and do this every 3 or 4 years. It's a challenge.
So I just want to flag, we're going to switch over to doing the Q&A soon. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. Is that, is there a technical glitch on my side, or is, we'll come back to that in a moment. But I'll turn it over to, Florence in just a moment here. But, my final question is if you have any concluding thoughts about, this concept of the series diversity in diplomacy. And then, in particular, just kind of picking up on what you were just saying, like, do you see a path forward for how diversity can be encouraged within the Foreign Service?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I do. I'm a strong proponent for diversity in the Foreign Service and other workplaces, because I do think that the Foreign Service ought to be reflective of Canadian society as a whole. But also, I think there are advantages in having a diverse pool of people that bring forward different points of view, different worldviews, and we're not, not all thinking the same. So, I think that there's a great deal of strength in having that diverse Foreign Service. I had one other, so, I do think that there is an awareness of the need for diversity and the importance of diversity. And I think work is being done in terms of developing training for staff, about the implicit bias, about diversity more general, and aiming at managers and heads of mission who are in positions of power, in terms of deciding about appointments and postings. So, I do think that there has been a start, and I think it's important work that needs to be continued. And I know that the department has recently taken some steps to strengthen their capacity to look at these issues, drawing on people in the workforce to look at diversity.
You know what? I'm gonna ask you one last question before I turn it over to Florence. This is off the cuff. So you know, what makes you hopeful about the future? And then you know what still keeps you up at night? You know, so just as a final comment, like what makes you hopeful, and what keeps you up at night? You know, as far as diversity in the Foreign Service.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I mentioned before, I mean, there have been some advancements, you know, such as the 50% of the heads of mission now are women. And that's huge, because I remember when I worked for the deputy minister, it was only 25%. And I looked at the list and I spoke with the deputy minister and I expressed some surprise. So then I went back and looked, and there were only 25% of the applicants were women. So there's been a real effort to encourage women to apply, and this has borne fruit over the years. And the same with diversity. I mean, you had one of my former colleagues as a speaker before about being an African American consul in Georgia. You know, so that there's been an effort to put people from diverse backgrounds into positions of influence. So I am hopeful about that. I guess what keeps me up at night is that it's a bureaucracy, you know, and so there has to be kind of continual pushing to get the bureaucracy to change, because, you know, otherwise people get complacent and decide to move on to another issue. But it's such an important issue that it's something that has to be top of mind, you know, on an ongoing basis.
Great. That's really, yeah, that's fascinating. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ganfield now. So I see the comments coming in at the Q&A. If you haven't been able to find it, the Q&A should be at the bottom of your screen, two little text bubbles that says Q&A, and you can type your answers in there. So thank you so much, Deborah. And,
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you, Deborah. It's just an honor to meet you. I'm Florence Glanfield. I'm the Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research at the University of Alberta. And this is an inaugural role. We've never had a Vice Provost related to Indigenous initiatives in the past. So it's my honor to be with you today. And we received some questions prior to the beginning of the webinar, and then a few now. So I'm just going to draw on one that was submitted prior to the beginning. And it kind of picks up a little bit on what you were just talking about in sort of the emphasis of the Foreign Service. Like, in your experience, have you seen a shift from an emphasis on one of the focus of Foreign Service to a different emphasis in the experiences that you've had? And I know you talked a little bit about the changes of the government, or the hope is for change in government structure, but maybe it's about colonial acts, or maybe it's about the emphasis of the directions of Foreign Service. Have you seen a change over your experience? This is over the times you've been involved.
Thank you for the question. And I just have to say, I love the art that's in your office. It's fabulous.
This is my home.
Oh, wow. Well, that's gorgeous.
And I should show you the beadwork. I have my grandmother's moss bag beaded.
Oh,
yeah.
So I'm not really sure sort of the intent of the question, like in terms of the change in policy, or the change in structure, or the change in the nature of the Foreign Service. I would say in terms of the latter, you know, I do believe that there has been it's significant change in terms of the people that come in now versus, when I entered 30 odd years ago. I think that the people that come in now are much more, probably have more experience internationally than many of us did at the time, just because it's so much more common for people to travel now, work overseas, work on international issues. So I do think that the people that are coming in are much more aware of the issues than we would have been, certainly that I would have been coming into the department 30 years ago. So I do think there's been a significant change. And, as I said as well, that, there's been a change in terms of the makeup of the Foreign Service. The number of women, there are more women, there are more people from, diverse ethnic backgrounds. So I think that has been a real positive change. And with that, people bring their own experiences, their own, values and principles, as I discussed earlier with Matthew. You bring those to the table and you bring those to your colleagues. So I do think that the Foreign Service and the department as a whole is changing in that way.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah, because I think it's really interesting, that to think about when there's different people at the table to have conversations about policy and initiatives, then the fundamental work of the organization shifts in its way as well, doesn't it? When there are different voices at the table. And I think about your work in the Foreign Service and the Government of Canada, even working to acknowledge and value Indigenous knowledge systems. And we bring that as individuals, but we also help to contribute to the collective. Now I'm going to move to a question that is in the question and answer that was posed just in your talk. What was it like to grow up in Germany as a Cree person? And yeah.
So I never actually lived in Germany because my parents didn't have kids at the time. They moved back to Chilliwack, and that's where I was born. So we grew up in British Columbia, in Ontario, British Columbia, as the only Cree family in the town. Yeah, it was, it was fine. I mean, where I grew up, the town that I grew up was really diverse ethnically. So it didn't make that huge of a difference. I mean, there were reserves around, so we didn't stick out that much. Not as much as we would have had we actually lived in Germany.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, I'll ask another one from the question and answer. As an Indigenous person who grew up divorced from their culture, but seen as the token First Nations person in a lot of predominantly white communities, what can I do to raise awareness or sow the seeds for compassion?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, it's, I think that's a challenge many people face growing up off reserve and maybe not having the opportunity to learn about, the teachings of your family or your community. I think the main thing that you can do is learn about those teachings and learn the language if possible, and share. I think that people are really, they welcome any type of input, even if it's, recommending your favorite Indigenous authors to friends, or, providing them with Indigenous art, or inviting them along to go attend a powwow or whatever. So I think that sharing is the important thing that can be done with non-Indigenous people. And I think that helps yourself as well. If you can make this part of yourself and then share it with somebody else.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to go to one of the questions that came in earlier. And again, from your vast experience, what can Canada learn from other countries, do you believe, in their relationships with Indigenous peoples?
That's a very good question. And you know, it's I think that there's a lot that can be learned both at the government level and at the individual level. And at the government level, one of the things I was just thinking about was the Arctic Circle, the fact there's a council for the Arctic peoples that includes Canada, of course, and Russia and Denmark, Iceland. And, that's an opportunity where the Indigenous peoples can meet, but also the governments can meet and can learn about issues of common or singular concern. So that's one way of sharing that information. And I know that has been an area where Canada has taken quite a bit back from the Arctic Council. The government has taken quite a bit back. I think that there are opportunities to learn about relations with Indigenous peoples in the international fora, like the UN or the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I do think if you look at Canadian positions over the years, you can see that there has been significant change in the positions. And I think part of that has been due to the discussions that take place internationally, both with state representatives and Indigenous representatives. But I also think that there's an opportunity to learn from each other at the individual level. And I'm thinking on development projects and even commercial ventures. I know that there are some groups in Canada that are working with Indigenous groups overseas. For example, in the area of coffee, there was I remember reading in the newspaper about a coffee place in the north that has direct links with coffee manufacturers, cultivators in South America. So it was really interesting, and this is something that has developed over the years. And so I think that there's a fair amount that can be learned both in Canada and overseas about sort of Indigenous business development and working with the government. So I think there are lots of opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. I think there are. And I mean, you touched on a couple of points in relationship to sovereignty even, right? And how is it that we better understand sovereignty as a collective in this place we call Canada? And you talked a bit about this earlier with your experience as a lawyer with the United Nations Declaration of Independence, or for the rights of Indigenous peoples, right? Independence. Yeah. So that notion of collectivity and sovereignty, I think, are really two big pieces that I think still have to have spaces for developing understanding among the broader understanding of what it means to be Indigenous and government relations with Indigenous people.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now there's a question from an individual who was actually working in Guatemala, or was working for the United States Agency for International Development at the time that you were an ambassador to Guatemala. And this individual was born in Guatemala City. And so the question comes from those experiences And the question is, can you tell us some interesting experiences as an ambassador there at the time and your relationships with some Indigenous communities?
Well, one of my favorite memories is going to a very remote community on the side of a mountain where we had a small project there where we gave scholarships to girls to allow them to stay in school, because one of the problems in Guatemala is that, you know, the young girls don't stay in school or don't have the opportunity to stay in school. They get married, they have children at a very young age, and it just kind of, the cycle of poverty continues. So for us, it was important to provide these scholarships. So I had the opportunity to go and meet with this community, which was Indigenous, and speak to them, speak to the girls, to talk to them, to tell them that I was an Indigenous person, and that in, you know, my family, in my culture, that there's a great emphasis placed on education, and, you know, to talk to them about the importance of staying in school. And it was fun because, you know, after the discussions and we got to sit, you know, talk, I had the opportunity to talk to some of the girls. So it was really nice to be able to connect with them on kind of one-on-one basis. One of the other projects that I was really happy with was it was actually inspired by USAID, which is the organization that this person worked for. They had Indigenous interns working for them, and so what we did was we set up a similar program where we were able to hire Indigenous advisors. So these are people from the local communities who work with the team in the embassy to provide advice on Indigenous issues as they affect Guatemalans and provide policy advice. And that is still an ongoing program, and it's proved itself to be very useful, both for the individual, but also for the embassy. So that was a project that I was really happy to help put into place, and pleased to see that it still continues.
Wow, thank you so much. Your words are so inspiring, Deborah. And I'm going to wrap up the question and answer period with a final one, because our colleague said that you have been massively inspiring about how we can continue to push boundaries. And this colleague and the person who asked the question is a young woman from Wood Mountain First Nation. And so the questions in terms of your education, what has served you the best, and what have served you the best, and would you have done it the same again? A really tough question, isn't it?
Well, I would say that the best experience that I had was the Master's in Public Administration. And that was because it was the opportunity to think about all the work that I had done and try and put things together in a coherent fashion as, you know, as I look forward to the remainder of my career. So that was really very positive. And I encourage colleagues to think about doing a mid-career education program precisely for that reason, because it does give you the time to reflect on where you've been and where you're going. So that was really positive. The other thing, what I have done differently, excuse me, well, probably I wouldn't have studied engineering, but you know, I had to take an undergrad degree anyway, so it might as well have been engineering as something else. I would just say that I think one of the challenges that I faced, and I alluded to this earlier, was really not having enough confidence in myself. And I think this is something that's shared by other women as well. And, you know, in hindsight, I wish I had been more confident. That, you know, it would have saved me a lot of angst. So what I would say is, you know, to people that are studying or early in their career, to really take pride in what you've done, where you've come from. Don't judge yourself by others, but just acknowledge, you know, all that you've done and be proud of yourself for that.
Well, thank you. And Deborah, in hindsight, I really appreciated your degree in mechanical engineering. When I first went to university, I did a degree in mathematics, and really, and I laughed to myself because I've also had the opportunity to travel and engage and work internationally. And now one of the questions I often get asked first is, how is it that you as an Indigenous woman could even get a university degree, right? Because in some of the regions of the world that I've traveled to, having a woman, first of all, have a university degree, but then having somebody get a degree in mathematics or a science area, and then even a PhD, right, is just so inspiring for other young women in those communities. And so I've often been asked to talk about what drew me to these programs. And for you, I felt a sense of passion throughout your words today too, and curiosity. So I thank you for your inspiring words, for your gift of experience and teachings that you've shared with us today. And really just so grateful that you took this time to be with us today. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Danielle Scott, who will bring a closing to our session. And again, so grateful for the teachings you've shared. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Florence. Yeah, my name is Danielle Scott. I'm the Director of International Relations at the University of Alberta. So I just want to echo Florence's comments and thanks, and say that on behalf of the whole audience, we are so grateful for the unique experiences and insights that you've shared with us today based on your work as an Indigenous diplomat around the world. And some of the things I took out of that were the importance of building relationships and recognizing collective rights and connecting with other peoples around the world, in particular, the Indigenous peoples that you mentioned you were able to connect with. And I'm sure that you served as a great source of inspiration and hope for them, as you are today for all of us. So again, we're really grateful for that, and also appreciate the hope that you have offered. You mentioned that the increase in diversity in the Foreign Service was a source of hope. So that's, I think, also inspiring for all of us. So thank you again. And I also want to say thanks to all of the viewers today. Also, we had missed acknowledging a special guest earlier, and that is the former Lieutenant Governor, the Honorable Lois Mitchell, had also signed up as part of this webinar. So there are many, many people who signed up. We had over 250 people register. So thanks to the interest of all of the audience. I know, looking at the feedback we've received in the questions and answers, everyone has really appreciated this opportunity to learn from you, Deborah. So thank you. And I'd also like to offer my thanks to all of the colleagues who worked together as a great team to organize this webinar. The video recording will be available later. We'll send out an email to everyone who registered, and it will be posted on various places on the university website. And I'm also, lastly, very excited to mention our next session as part of the Diversity and Diplomacy series will be in February as part of Black History Month. We will be hosting the Ambassador of Mali to Canada, and that will be in collaboration with our French language campus, Campus Saint-Jean. So thank you again to everyone, and we'll look forward to connecting with people in February at our next session. Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.